He moved through the city the way he moved through everything, like the pavement had been informed in advance to make room. Kang Joon-ho did not walk fast. He never had to. Seoul had taught him that men who rush are men who are afraid, and fear was not a language his body spoke anymore. It was a Tuesday evening in late autumn, the kind where the cold had teeth but hadn't bitten down yet, and he had sent his driver home 2 blocks back because some nights his mind needed the friction of concrete instead of the hush of leather seats. He walked past the tailor who had made 3 of his suits and the noodle shop where the owner still bowed too low, and he walked past the glass front of a restaurant called Provenance, the kind of place where the wine list cost more than most men's rent, and that was where his evenings stopped being simple. Through the window, under a chandelier throwing gold across white tablecloths, he saw her. Naomi Carter, 24 years old, his assistant for the last 14 months. The woman who color-coded his calendar and rewrote his emails so they sounded like a human being had written them and once told him, flatly, without blinking, that he'd scheduled 2 meetings with rival factions in the same building on the same day, and did he want to explain that to the hospital or should she cancel one? She was the only person in his organization who spoke to him like his silence wasn't a weapon pointed at her. She was wearing red. A sleeveless dress the color of the wine in the glass in front of her, her hair down instead of in the low bun she wore to the office, and she was smiling at a man across the table who was leaning in like he had all the time in the world to memorize her face. Joon-ho stopped walking. He recognized the man. Everyone in his world eventually recognized everyone else in it. Min-Joon Park, CEO of a shipping conglomerate whose ledgers were cleaner on paper than they were in practice, a man who smiled with his teeth and negotiated with his lawyers standing behind him like a second row of teeth. Park reached across the table and set a bouquet of red roses into her hands, and she laughed, a real laugh, the kind Joon-ho had heard exactly twice in 14 months, and neither time had been directed at him. Something moved through his chest that he did not have a name for because he had spent years making sure he never needed one. He did not go inside. That was the first thing he was proud of later, and the only thing. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets, watching a woman who typed his emails and interrupted his silences laugh at another man's jokes, and he understood. With a clean, surgical clarity he brought to every other problem in his life, that he did not merely dislike what he was looking at. He wanted to walk through that glass and put his hand around the back of Min-Joon Park's neck and explain to him, very quietly, exactly how many ways there were to disappear a man who touched something that belonged to him. The thought arrived whole, and it terrified him more than any gun ever had, because Naomi did not belong to him. That was the truth sitting under the anger, like a stone under water. She was his employee. She had never once given him a reason to think of her as anything else, and if she had, if she'd so much as looked at him the way she was looking at Park right now, he would not have known what to do with it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't look at it. He kept watching until Park reached across the table again, this time for her hand, and Joon-ho turned and walked the rest of the way home with his jaw so tight it ached the next morning. He did not sleep that night. He told himself it was business. There was a shipment coming in from Busan that needed clearing. A lieutenant named Sang-hoon who'd been asking too many questions about routes that weren't his to know, a rival faction out of the Western District that had been testing his borders for 3 weeks running. There was enough real danger in his life that he shouldn't have had room left over to lie awake replaying the exact angle of a stranger's hand over his assistant's. He had room anyway. He stood at the window of his own penthouse for a long time before dawn, watching the city do the thing it always did, indifferent, glittering, unbothered by the fact that a man who ran half its underside was standing in the dark thinking about a woman's laugh instead of the shipment from Busan. He had built this view for himself over a decade, floor by floor, deal by deal, and it had never once made him feel like this, small and exposed in a way that no rival faction had ever managed to make him feel. He thought about calling her. He thought about a dozen reasons to call her, a scheduling question, a document he needed early, anything that would let him hear her voice before the sun came up and the day demanded he be someone else. He did not call her. He stood at the glass instead and let the ache sit in his chest like a stone he refused to set down, because some part of him understood that naming it would make it real, and he was not ready to make anything about Naomi Carter real yet. At 6 the next morning, he was at his desk before the sun had fully committed to the sky, and at 8:15 Naomi walked in wearing her office armor, gray blazer, hair back in its bun, a coffee in each hand because she had learned months ago that he was unbearable before caffeine and had simply started solving the problem without being asked. She set his cup down at his elbow and started reading off his schedule before she'd even sat down, and he watched her mouth move and thought about roses. "You're not listening," she said.
I'm listening.
"You're doing the thing where your eyes are open but there's nobody home." She tilted her head. "Rough night." "Long night," he said, which was true, and let it end there, because the alternative was telling her he'd stood outside a restaurant window like a stray dog watching a family eat dinner through glass, and that was a version of himself he did not intend to let exist out loud. She went back to the schedule. He went back to pretending to listen. And that was the moment everything changed, though neither of them would have called it that yet, because nothing had happened. Nothing had happened at all. That was precisely the problem. The rehook came 4 days later, when the Western District finally stopped testing his borders and started crossing them. It happened at a warehouse near the harbor that his organization used to move goods that didn't appear on any manifest. Junho was there himself, which was unusual, but Sang-hoon's questions had made him unwilling to trust the handoff to anyone he couldn't watch personally. Naomi was there too, in the outer office with a laptop, handling the legitimate shipping paperwork that gave the whole operation its clean face, because she was the only person he trusted to make the numbers look boring enough that nobody looked twice. The first shot came through the office window before either of them heard the car. Junho was moving before the glass finished falling. He crossed the room in 4 strides, hooked his arm around Naomi's waist, and put his own body between her and the window as 2 more rounds punched through the drywall where her head had been a second earlier. She didn't scream. He would think about that later, how she went rigid and silent instead of loud, how her hands came up and grabbed fistfuls of his jacket instead of covering her face. "Down," he said, low, and pulled her to the floor with him behind the steel filing cabinet that had, until 30 seconds ago, been a boring piece of office furniture. Gunfire rattled outside, short bursts, his men returning fire, the specific choreography of violence he had spent his whole adult life learning to read like weather. He could tell from the rhythm that it was 4 men, maybe 5, undisciplined, spraying rather than aiming, which meant amateurs sent to make a point rather than professionals sent to finish a job. That should have made him calmer. It didn't, because Naomi was pressed against his side with her heart slamming hard enough that he could feel it through 2 layers of clothing, and every instinct he had was screaming at him to get her out of the building instead of holding position like tactics demanded. "There's a service door," she said into his ear, breathless but steady. "Behind the pallets. I saw it when I did inventory last month." He looked at her. Even now, glass in her hair, hands shaking around the fabric of his jacket, she was solving the problem instead of waiting for him to solve it for her. "Show me," he said, and she did, crawling low across the floor with him covering her, and when they burst through the service door into the alley behind the warehouse, he put himself first through the exit, checked the alley was clear, and then, because he could not stop himself, took her face in both hands for 1 second to make sure she was not bleeding anywhere he couldn't see. "I'm fine," she said, and her voice cracked on the second word, and something in his chest cracked with it. "You're not fine. You are alive. Those are different things." He let her go like her skin had burned him, and pulled his weapon and moved them both toward the car waiting 2 streets over, and he did not look at her again until they were inside it, and the engine was running, and the warehouse was 3 blocks behind them with his men still handling what was left of the mess. The car smelled like leather and cordite, and neither of them said anything for several blocks. Junho kept his eyes on the passing streets, counting mirrors, counting cars, doing the arithmetic of danger he had done 10,000 times before, and underneath it, quieter, he kept doing a different kind of arithmetic entirely, counting the seconds since he had last checked that she was breathing beside him. She had her hands folded in her lap, knuckles pale, and she was staring straight ahead the way people stare when they are holding themselves together through sheer will, and he wanted to reach over and take one of those hands in his, and did not let himself, because he did not trust what his hands would do once they started. In the car, in the dark, she finally let herself shake. "Who were they?" she said. Not a question. A demand. "Nobody you need to carry. I just crawled through broken glass because somebody wanted you dead, Junho. I think I've earned the right to carry a little of it." It was the first time she'd used his given name without a title in front of it. He noticed. He filed it away in the part of himself that noticed everything and said nothing, and he told her in careful, edited pieces about the Western District and the borders they'd been testing and the message that had just been sent through a window in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. She listened without flinching, and when he finished, she didn't ask him to fire her, didn't ask to be reassigned somewhere safer, didn't do any of the sensible things a sensible woman would do. She asked, "What's the plan?" He almost smiled. Almost. "The plan is that you go home and you do not come back to that warehouse." "That wasn't what I asked." "It's what you're getting." She looked out the window at the city sliding past, jaw set the way it got when she decided something, and was choosing not to argue about it out loud yet, and he recognized the expression because he wore it himself in every mirror he owned. He studied her profile in the passing light, the set of her mouth, the way her hands had finally stopped shaking somewhere around the third red light, and he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that she had a kind of courage that had nothing to do with recklessness. Recklessness was easy. He had employed 100 men who mistook one for the other and buried most of them. What she had was rarer, the ability to be afraid all the way through and act anyway, and he did not yet have the words to tell her that this quality, more than the red dress or the laugh he'd heard through a restaurant window, was the thing that had actually undone him. That night, after he'd dropped her at her building and watched her disappear through the lobby doors before he let the car pull away, he sat alone in the back seat and understood that the thing he'd felt outside the restaurant window wasn't jealousy dressed up as something smaller. It was fear. Fear that had been waiting a long time for a reason to introduce itself, and it had finally found one, and its name was watching Naomi Carter crawl across broken glass because his war had reached far enough to touch her. He'd lost a woman to this life before.
Suhin.
9 years ago, before Naomi, before the empire had fully hardened into what it was now. Sujin had not been in the life. She'd been a violinist who didn't know what he did until the night it walked into her apartment and took her from him as a message to a rival who'd since been dead for 6 years. He had built the entire architecture of himself since then around one rule: nobody gets close enough to become collateral again. Naomi had gotten close anyway. He hadn't even seen it happen. The next morning, she came in with a bandage on her forearm from a glass cut she hadn't mentioned in the car, and she set his coffee down and said, "I'm not quitting, if that's what you're building up to. I wasn't going to ask you to quit. You were going to try to reassign me somewhere boring. I can see it on your face. You have exactly one face for that. I have several faces. I run an empire. Men who cannot read my face lose fingers. I can read all of them," she said. "That's the problem. I've had 14 months of practice, and you've never once made it easy." "You have one," she said. "It's the one you're making right now." He looked at her for a long moment, at the bandage, at the steady hands holding a coffee cup like nothing had tried to kill her 20 hours earlier, and he made a decision that violated 9 years of careful architecture. "Stay close to me for the next few weeks," he said. "Not the office."
Me.
"Until this settles." "Is that a professional request or something else?" "I don't know yet," he said, which was the most honest sentence he'd spoken to another human being in longer than he wanted to admit, and she held his gaze for 3 full seconds before she nodded and went back to his schedule like the ground hadn't just shifted under both of them. That is when she made the mistake of looking up too long, and he made the mistake of letting her. The weeks that followed rearranged the borders of Junho's life, without either of them naming what was happening. She was in his car more than in the office. She sat in on meetings she had no professional reason to attend, taking notes that weren't really notes, watching the room the way he'd taught her without meaning to teach her anything. Lieutenant Sang-hoon, the one who'd been asking questions that weren't his to ask, started directing those questions toward her instead, subtle, testing whether the boss's assistant had become something worth exploiting. She reported every single one of those conversations to Junho within the hour, word for word, and the fact that she reported them instead of being flattered by the attention told him something about her that he filed away with everything else he was collecting and refusing to examine. One night, 3 weeks into the new arrangement, they were in his penthouse going over shipment routes on the dining table because his office had become a target and his home hadn't yet, and she reached across him for a folder at the same moment he reached for the same folder, and their hands landed on top of each other, and neither of them moved. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when two people have stopped pretending they aren't aware of each other's skin. "Jun-ho," she said, and stopped, like she'd surprised herself by saying it. "Say it again," he said low. "Say what?" "My name." "Say it like that again." She looked up at him, and something in her face he'd never seen before, something unguarded, something that made her look younger and more frightening than any enemy he'd faced in years, and she said his name a third time, quiet, careful, like she was testing whether it would hold her weight. He did not kiss her. He wanted to, with an intensity that scared him more than the gunfire had, but he had learned patience the hard way, and he was not going to spend hers cheaply. Instead, he lifted her hand, still resting on top of his, and pressed his mouth once to her knuckles, brief, deliberate, and let her go. "Go home, Naomi," he said, voice rough. "Before I stop being careful." She left. But at the door she turned back and said, "I don't actually want you to be careful." And then she was gone before he could answer, and he stood alone in his own dining room with his pulse doing something it hadn't done in 9 years. The Western District escalated a week later, and this time the message wasn't a warehouse window. It was Naomi's apartment building, a car parked outside for 3 days that her doorman finally reported, and when Junho's men pulled the plates they came back to a name connected to the faction that had been testing him since autumn. They weren't testing anymore. They had found his weakness, and they were pointing at it with both hands. He moved her into his penthouse that night without asking permission, and for once she didn't argue, because she'd seen the look on his face and understood it wasn't a negotiation. "You didn't tell me it was this bad," she said, standing in his living room with one suitcase, still in her work clothes, jaw tight with something that wasn't fear so much as fury at being made a target. "I didn't want it to be this bad." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She crossed the room and stood close enough that he could smell her perfume under the fierce sweat, close enough that the air between them stopped being empty the way it always stopped being empty when she got within a foot of him. "I need you to tell me the truth about something," she said. "Is this happening because of what you do, or is this happening because of me? Because if men are pointing guns at my building over a woman you haven't even kissed yet, I need to understand what I actually am to you before I let you rearrange my entire life." The honesty in the question demanded an equal honesty back, and he gave it to her, because she had earned it in glass and gunfire and 3 weeks of not running. "You are the first person in years who has made me feel like something other than an instrument," he said. "I built my whole life so nobody could use you against me, and it didn't work because I let you in anyway, and I would do it again. I told myself keeping you close was strategy. I was lying to myself. It was never strategy." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she reached up and touched the small scar above his eyebrow, the one from an incident 9 years old that she'd never asked about because she'd sensed it wasn't hers to ask. "Okay," she said. "Then don't lie to me again. About anything. I can't survive danger. I can't survive being managed." "I won't manage you." "You will try," she said, almost gentle. "Just stop trying before I catch you." That night she didn't go to the guest room he'd prepared for her. She stayed in the doorway of his instead, and neither of them said anything about it out loud, and in the morning she was still there, and something between them had shifted from possibility into fact. They fell, in those quiet days, into a rhythm that neither of them acknowledged as domestic because acknowledging it felt like tempting the war to notice. She made coffee in his kitchen the way she made it in the office, strong enough to argue with, and he learned the specific silence she needed in the mornings before she was fully a person, and gave it to her without being asked the same way she had always given him his. In the evenings, when the reports came in from his lieutenants and the numbers on the shipment routes stopped making sense from exhaustion, she would sit across from him at the table with her own laptop, not working exactly, just present, and some nights that presence was the only thing that kept the walls of the penthouse from feeling like another kind of warehouse, another kind of trap. He caught himself, more than once, watching her read instead of watching the door, and understanding, with a kind of low dread, that his instincts had started prioritizing her over his own survival, and that this was either the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him, or the first genuinely good one. The Western District's next move came 4 days later, and it was not subtle. Sang-hoon, the lieutenant with too many questions, was found dead in his own car 2 blocks from Junho's building, a message carved into the leather seat rather than his skin, a warning that read like a promise instead of a threat. Junho understood immediately that Sang-hoon had been selling information, and that the information had included the location of the woman he'd moved into his penthouse. He wanted to lock her in a vault and post 50 men around it. She refused before he'd finished the sentence. "You use me to plan strategy," she said, standing in his office with her arms crossed and her chin up. "I've watched you run this organization for over a year. I know your calendar, your routes, your patterns better than most of your own lieutenants. Lock me away, and you're not protecting me. You're blinding yourself. Use me instead." "This isn't a boardroom, Naomi." "No," she said. "It's my life. Let me have a say in how I survive it." He hated how right she was. He hated it enough that he agreed, though he made her promise, twice, that she would stay behind the line once the plan was in motion, and she had agreed both times with an ease that should have warned him, because Naomi Carter did not agree to things easily, unless she had already decided how she was going to break the agreement the moment it mattered. Together they built a trap using the exact information Sang-hoon had likely sold, a fake meeting at a location that didn't exist, a fabricated schedule that would draw the Western District's remaining leadership into the open where his men could finally end the thing that had started with a bullet through a warehouse window. The night it happened, she was supposed to be safe in the penthouse. She was not in the penthouse. She had followed the operation to the perimeter with a car and a burner phone, telling herself she was only there to relay information faster than his men could manage on their own, and when the ambush that Junho's people had built started closing on the Western District's crew, one of them broke away from the trap entirely and ran straight toward the car she was sitting in, because somewhere in the chaos, somebody had recognized her from the warehouse 3 weeks prior and decided she was worth more as a hostage than the whole operation was worth as a kill. She did not scream this time either. She put the car into gear and drove straight at him instead of away, forcing him to dive clear of the hood, and then she was out of the car and running, not toward safety, but toward the sound of Junho's voice giving orders 2 streets over, because some instinct in her had decided that being near him was safer than being anywhere he wasn't. He found her at the edge of the operation with blood on her sleeve that wasn't hers, breathing hard, alive, and the sight of her upright and moving under her own power did something to his chest that no gunfire ever had. He crossed the distance between them in a way that had nothing tactical in it at all, hauled her against him hard enough to knock the breath out of both of them, and held on. "You were supposed to be safe," he said into her hair, voice wrecked in a way he'd never let anyone hear. "I was safer here," she said. "I'm always safer where you are. I just took a while to admit it." The operation finished around them, the Western District's leadership either dead or in custody, the threat that had followed them since autumn finally closed. But neither of them was thinking about the operation anymore. He pulled back just far enough to look at her face, cataloging every inch of it for damage, and when he was satisfied she was whole, he did the thing he had been holding back for 3 weeks and kissed her like the city wasn't still smoking 2 streets away. She kissed him back like she'd been waiting exactly as long as he had. "This is a mistake," he said against her mouth, not stopping. "Probably," she agreed, not stopping either. The cost came 3 days later, not in blood, but in something quieter. A rival faction from the north, watching the West collapse, tried to move into the vacuum, and Junho spent 2 brutal days rebuilding the borders he'd nearly lost while protecting her. He came home each night with less of himself than he'd left with, and she was there each time, not asking him to be softer than the work required, just present, a fixed point in a life that had spent 9 years without one. On the 3rd night, exhausted, he sat at his own dining table with his head in his hands, and she came and stood behind him and put her hands on his shoulders, and he let himself lean back into her instead of pretending he didn't need to. "I almost lost you twice this month," he said. "You didn't lose me either time. I'm the one who kept showing up." She pressed her mouth to the top of his head. I'm not going anywhere, Junho. I decided that in a car with a bullet hole in the window. Everything since then has just been me proving it. He turned in the chair and looked up at her, this woman who had walked into his life to manage a calendar and stayed to survive a war, who had never once let him decide for her what she could carry. I saw you on a date, he admitted finally, the confession he'd been circling for weeks. The night before the warehouse. Through a restaurant window. I stood on the sidewalk like a stranger, and I wanted to put my hands on a man I'd never met because he was touching something I hadn't even claimed yet. I have never wanted to hurt someone that badly over so little reason, and it terrified me, because it meant you already mattered before I'd let myself notice. Naomi's expression didn't soften into anything easy. It sharpened instead, the way it always did when she was deciding whether to let a man off the hook or hold him to something harder. Minjun Park was polite and boring and safe, she said, and I went home from that date thinking about a man who color codes his silences instead of his words. You didn't lose to him, Junho. You were never actually competing. I just hadn't told you that yet. You could have told me sooner. You could have said something sooner instead of glaring at your coffee for 3 days. A small, real smile. We're both terrible at this. I'm not terrible at claiming what's mine, he said, and pulled her down into his lap with a certainty that finally had nothing careful left in it. I was only terrible at admitting you already were. She stayed. Not because he'd rescued her, and not because the danger had made the choice for her, but because somewhere between broken glass and a fake meeting that had nearly gotten her taken, she had looked at the life he offered, all its violence and precision and cost, and decided it was still a life she wanted to be inside of, with him, awake, with her eyes open. Weeks later, the city had gone quiet the way cities do after a war finishes without announcing itself, and Junho stood at the window of his penthouse in the evening light watching Naomi across the room, laughing at something on her phone, hair loose the way it never was in the office, and he thought about the night he'd stood outside a restaurant like a man locked out of his own life, aching over a woman he hadn't even let himself want yet. He didn't feel that ache anymore. He felt something steadier, something that didn't flinch when tested because it had already been tested and it had held. She looked up and caught him watching, and instead of looking away, she held his gaze the way she always did now, unafraid, unmanaged, entirely her own, and crossed the room to stand beside him at the glass. What are you thinking about? She asked. That I used to watch you through windows, he said, and now I don't have to. She slipped her hand into his, and neither of them said anything else for a long moment, the city humming 12 floors below them, indifferent and glittering the way it always was, the way it had been the night he stood outside a restaurant window and understood for the first time what it meant to want something he could not immediately take. He thought of Sujin sometimes still, in the quiet hours, and he no longer flinched from the thought the way he once had, because Naomi had never asked him to forget her, only to let her stand somewhere Sujin never got the chance to stand, in the daylight, unguarded, aware of every danger, and choosing it anyway. That, he had come to understand, was the difference between being loved by someone who didn't know what he was and being chosen by someone who knew exactly what he was and stayed regardless. Stay, he said, quiet, though she had given him no reason to think she was going anywhere. I told you already, she said, tightening her fingers around his. I'm not the kind of woman who says a thing once. Some things didn't need declaring anymore. They only needed to be true. If this story kept you holding your breath until the very last line, you already know what to do. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next dangerous, slow-burn obsession waiting for you. Drop a comment telling me which line hit hardest, and turn on notifications because the next story is coming, and it might just be the most dangerous one yet.